Welcome back to week 2. This week we are focusing on the international normative and legal basis for the protection of freedom of expression. We've looked at the international system and the regional systems. We are also going to consider a national system, that of the First Amendment, because of what I believe to be the global influence and historical influence of the First Amendment throughout the last at least 50 years. And we are very lucky to have with us for this segment President Bollinger, very renowned First Amendment scholar and the author of many books on the First Amendment. So, President Bollinger, thank you very much for joining us for this segment. I'm going to start with a bit of what I find to be an enigmatic quote that you have made yours in many ways, because I've noted that you mention it in several of your books. It's Holmes, who said in one of his earlier decisions that the First Amendment is an experiment, as all life is an experiment. Can you maybe tell us what you think Holmes mean, and what does it mean to you?
Well, I think it's a very powerful statement by saying that he is expressing some doubt in his own mind as to whether what he is arguing for under freedom of speech and press is actually a good idea or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But to do that is to do exactly what it is that we hope we will achieve through freedom of speech and press. That is, I think of freedom of speech and press, First Amendment, as really relating to how we want to be as people and understanding ourselves. I mean, he also says in that decision, persecution for the expression of opinions is perfectly logical. Mm-hmm. That's an extraordinary thing to say, that intolerance is natural. It's also striking to say, I believe we should take these steps to overcome that natural impulse, but I may be wrong. It's an experiment, and I think what he is doing, I think, is setting up as a model of just how we want to be in the society, in freedom of speech and press, but more generally. That is, understanding that we simply cannot know for sure about many things, including ideas that we may think of as fundamental, like free speech. Mm-hmm. That kind of spirit of inquiry, of challenge, of listening, of debating is, I think, revealed by that statement. I like it.
You know, if you had to make us go through the journey of the First Amendment, bring the students through the various stops, what will be the main phases?
Well, I think, of course, there is the adoption of the Bill of Rights following the adoption of the Constitution, and of course that's in the 18th century. And then all through the 19th century there are debates about free speech and free press and writings about it and so on, but there's no Supreme Court case. I mean, that's the amazing thing. Even though the Supreme Court has decided very early on in the 19th century that it will be the final arbiter of what the Constitution means, even though it's decided that, it doesn't decide anything about free speech, about the First Amendment, until its first decision in 1919. So everything that we take today as part of the jurisprudence of freedom of speech and press, First Amendment, everything of that jurisprudence begins with 1919. As you know, when we teach First Amendment, that's where we start. So the second thing is to realize that that start is not an auspicious beginning. No. And there are three cases, all of which involve government censorship of speakers. And the speakers are each punished, sent to jail. And the Supreme Court in each of those decisions, in fact authored by the great Justice Holmes, says the First Amendment doesn't apply. Now, by today's standards of First Amendment jurisprudence, that's an outrage. They should have been protected.
Yeah.
It's even worse than that, because one of the speakers of those three cases was a candidate for President of the United States, Eugene Debs. And all he did was give a speech in Ohio in which he praised people who had resisted the draft, refused to be drafted, which was a crime, but he praised them. And only for that, or for that only, he was prosecuted by the government. This is a candidate for President of the United States. While he's in jail, he receives 1 million votes for President of the United States in 1920. So you start with this really extraordinary set of decisions in which freedom of speech and press is not applied, and then there begin to be second thoughts and doubts. And Holmes is the person who articulates that. And he does it in the decision that you just referred to, a couple of decisions. That begins then when Louis Brandeis joins the court, a series of opinions in which they speak very eloquently and powerfully to freedom of speech and press. And by the 1930s, this is beginning to be the way people start thinking about free speech and the First Amendment. Then in the 1950s, it caves again, and the court gives in to extraordinary repression and censorship. It's only in the 1960s when the Supreme Court, in a series of decisions, most notably New York Times versus Sullivan, begins to articulate the strong principle of free speech, free press that we have today. So it's a 100-year journey, starts poorly, rises, falls again in the 1950s, and picks up with the extreme protections we have today, where in the United States, speech is protected more than any other nation in the world, I think it's fair to say, and also more than any other nation in human history, I think is probably also true.
The current period, 2000, the beginning of the 21st century, if we were to take a long view, you know, we're 2050, we're looking back. Well, do you think this will be, is that going to be seen as a time where the First Amendment is under duress a bit, under challenged?
So it's a very interesting question. With the overview that I have just given, and that I know you have talked about, I think there are two ways to look to answer the question you pose. What will now look like in 2030 or 2050? I think one view would be every time the nation has experienced a feeling of insecurity and threat, especially from foreign entities and nations, the society, through legislation, through government action, and through judicial decision, has allowed excessive repression and intolerance. That was true at the beginning in 1919. I said it was true in the 1950s. If we are entering a period of really extraordinary sense of insecurity and sense of threat, one might say that history shows we will lose our First Amendment protections. And once that security passes, that insecurity passes, we will regain them and we will look back and say that was a terrible moment in human history, in US history. But that's what one would predict based upon what has happened before. I think the other view, and I think it's the one I would subscribe to, is that over the course of this century, free speech, free press has been so strongly articulated through decisions and elsewhere, that it has become an essential norm of the country where uniquely both the left and the right in American politics subscribe to this value. It's one of the few things I think you can say, on which you can say there is a general consensus about this value. That means that we are less likely to fall prey to our fears and to the impulse to be intolerant and to censor. We're less likely to fall than we were in the 1950s and in the period in World War I and outside of World War I. I think that's probably right. So I'm hopeful that even though we may have some bumps along the road here, that in 2030, 2050, we will look back and say we sustained it.
We were resilient.
Yes.
Looking back and in the current period, what are the key doctrines of the First Amendment, or the key elements? What's making the First Amendment such an innovative and kind of different perspective on freedom of expression?
I think one is that political expression, public discussion of public issues will receive the highest level of protection. And that's, I think, both on a theory that we're in a democracy and self-government requires this kind of openness. I think it also fits with my own theories about tolerance. That is, in the public sphere, we're going to be extremely tolerant in the area of speech in order to learn a lesson about ourselves and about tolerance more generally. But I think the public discussion, public issues, the political speech doctrine, in a sense, is a primary characteristic. I think, secondly, we will take this to what one might think of as an extreme. That is, we will protect speech far beyond what a normal view would be of what's reasonable. So the First Amendment is, as I often say, counterintuitive, not reasonable. It's protecting something that goes to an extreme. And that's an extremely important development, I think. It's certainly in the hate speech area, the inciting area, in libel, defamation, all to an extreme. I'd say a third thing is that there is a complexity to the First Amendment that I think is fascinating. I've personally been interested in the differential treatment of print media and broadcast media, which I think are based on different philosophies about how you organize and think about free speech fundamentally. In the print area, it's individuals and institutions have the right to say whatever they want and to curate their newspapers and magazines however they want. The government can't interfere. And in the broadcasting, the basic philosophy has been it's the people and the information and ideas they receive that is important, and the corporate owners of the media cannot be the ones to propagandize the public with this, and the government stands as a protector of the people and their need for information and ideas against the corporate owners. Those have played out very interestingly. I think the former thesis there, the notion about the print media, has become dominant. I think the notions of broadcast regulation have almost completely faded.
How do you assess the global journey of the First Amendment? It's not a straightforward journey. It's a complicated one for many reasons. From your perspective as a First Amendment scholar, what is it you would like the rest of the world to adopt, to think about, it may not just be a doctrine, it could be a way of doing things, it could be a legal discipline. What is it about this First Amendment experiment that should be so appealing to the rest of the world?
I think we're moving increasingly to a world in which democracy as a form of organizing societies and free markets, capitalism as a way of organizing the economies is spreading. And so once you start to go that route of greater and greater political freedom and accountability of governments and greater openness of markets and economic activity, I think this kind of framing of the principle of free speech, free press that we see in the United States makes more and more sense. I think even if you do not subscribe to democracy and self-government as a form of organizing the society, many societies like that don't subscribe to that are subscribing to an open economic marketplace. I think inevitably that leads you to a world in which there is greater accountability of governments to citizens, and in which citizens feel freer, economically wealthier, and therefore they want things, they want knowledge, they want information, they want a say in life. I think it changes people in directions that make free speech and free press more salient to them. I think it's also the case that as you move from a mercantile economy based around exports and resources to a more creative economy, a more, sort of creating a larger middle class and economically advantaged society, the more you will be dependent in the world economy on innovation. And the more you are dependent on innovation, the more you need freedom of mind, freedom of speech, freedom of exchange of ideas. So the forces that are shaping the world, democratization, so many places, but also open markets and capitalism pushes in this direction, I think.